Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to be talking about something that I know a lot of you are interested in, and that's strategies for overcoming depression.
Yeah, it's a topic that a lot of people struggle with.
Yeah, we found a really interesting podcast episode that we're going to be using as source material for this deep dive.
Okay.
And it outlines 10 different strategies that you can use to help overcome depression.
10. Wow.
I know, right? It's a lot to cover, but we're not just going to list off these 10 tips. We're going to actually try to dig into the why behind those tips. Like, why do they work?
Right. That's the important part.
Exactly. And I'm really excited to have you here to help us understand that, all the kind of scientific and psychological mechanisms that make these strategies effective.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here and help unpack some of that.
Awesome. So one of the things that really jumped out at me from this podcast episode was this idea that just 5 minutes of movement can act as a natural antidepressant.
Just 5.
5 minutes. That's like less time than it takes to make a cup of coffee. So I'm really curious to dive into that and figure out how that even works. Are you ready to unpack all of this?
I am. Let's do it.
Okay, so the first strategy that this podcast episode highlights is acknowledging your feelings.
Okay.
And they talk about how, when you're feeling depressed, there's this tendency to just want to shove those emotions down and try to, pretend they're not there.
Yeah, ignore them and hope they go away.
Yeah, exactly. But they actually argue that kind of makes things worse.
That makes sense if you think about it this way. Have you ever tried to hold a beach ball underwater?
Uh-huh.
It takes a ton of energy, and eventually that ball's going to pop right back up. Our emotions are kind of like that.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Trying to suppress them is exhausting and unsustainable.
So instead of fighting those feelings, we need to acknowledge them.
Yeah.
Which seems counterintuitive, doesn't it?
It might seem that way, but allowing yourself to feel those emotions, even the negative ones, is the first step toward processing them and moving through them.
So you're saying by kind of leaning into those emotions instead of resisting them, we can actually start to kind of process them and work through them.
Exactly. Think of it like tending a garden. You have to acknowledge the weeds are there before you can pull them.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this works. So the podcast recommends journaling as a way to acknowledge those feelings, which I've always found helpful, just kind of getting those thoughts out of your head and onto paper.
Right. It's like having a conversation with yourself.
Yeah.
Journaling can be really powerful. It's a safe space to explore your feelings without judgment.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating is that the act of writing things down actually engages different parts of the brain.
Really?
Yeah, it can help us make sense of our emotions and even identify patterns we might not have noticed otherwise.
So it's not just venting, it's actually a way to analyze those feelings.
Exactly. Oh. And sometimes understanding those feelings is all it takes to start shifting them.
Interesting. So the next strategy they talk about is all about reaching out for support.
Okay.
Which I think can be really tough, especially when you're feeling depressed.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely. Isolation is a common symptom of depression, but it can also make things worse.
Right.
We humans are wired for connection. It's essential to our well-being. When we isolate ourselves, we're essentially depriving our brains of a key nutrient.
It's like trying to survive on a diet of only junk food.
Exactly.
Eventually your body starts to crave those essential nutrients.
Right. And just like our bodies need nutritious food, our brains need social connection to thrive. Reaching out to someone, whether it's a friend, family member, therapist, even a support group, can provide that much needed nourishment.
That's so true. And the podcast even mentions that just being around people, even without actually talking, can help. Yeah. They say it reminds you that you're not alone. It's kind of like those times when you go to a coffee shop.
Yeah.
And just being surrounded by other people, even if you're not interacting with them, makes you feel less alone.
Interesting. There's actually a physiological explanation for that.
Is there?
Yeah. When we're around others, our brains release oxytocin, often called the cuddle hormone.
Oh.
It plays a key role in social bonding, and it reduces feelings of stress and anxiety.
So just being in the presence of others can actually change our brain chemistry.
It can. And that's why support systems are so crucial when dealing with depression. They provide that steady stream of oxytocin that our brains need.
Okay. Moving on to strategy number 3. Move your body.
All right.
So the podcast really emphasizes that even small amounts of movement can make a big impact on your mood, which is where that 5-minute idea comes in, right?
Right.
But how does that work? Is it just a distraction or is there something more to it?
It's much more than just a distraction.
Right.
Exercise, even in short bursts, has profound effects on our brains. It triggers the release of endorphins, which are our natural mood boosters. Think about that runner's high people talk about.
Right. But for those of us who aren't, marathon runners, what kind of movement are we talking about here? Like, do I need to go hit the gym for an hour to get those benefits?
No, not at all. You don't need intense workouts.
Okay.
Even a brisk 5-minute walk can significantly increase your endorphin production. Dancing, gardening, taking the stairs instead of the elevator, it all counts. The key is to find something you enjoy.
So it's really about finding ways to incorporate movement into your day, even in small ways. What's interesting is that they also talk about how exercise helps regulate other neurochemicals involved in mood.
Like what?
Like dopamine and serotonin. So it's like a really multi-pronged approach to lifting your mood.
Exactly. Movement is like hitting the reset button for your brain. It helps rebalance those neurochemicals, it improves blood flow, and it even promotes the growth of new brain cells.
New brain cells.
Yeah.
Wow. I did not realize exercise could do that.
It's remarkable, isn't it?
Yeah.
Our brains are constantly adapting and changing, and physical activity plays a key role in that process.
Okay, I'm definitely going to have to prioritize movement more. Now let's talk about sleep.
Oh, okay.
The podcast really emphasizes the importance of fixing your sleep schedule, when it comes to mental health.
Yeah.
Why is that so critical?
Sleep is our body's time to repair and recharge, both physically and mentally. It's when our brains process emotions, consolidate memories, and clear out toxins. When we don't get enough sleep, everything suffers.
So it's not just about feeling groggy the next day. It actually has long-term effects on our mental health.
Exactly. Chronic sleep deprivation can exacerbate depression symptoms and make it harder to cope with stress. It's like running your car on empty. Eventually, it's going to break down.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. I definitely notice that when I'm sleep deprived, I'm way more irritable, and my mood just takes a nosedive. So the podcast gives some practical tips for improving sleep, like sticking to a bedtime routine, avoiding screens before bed. It's like training your brain to kind of wind down at a certain time.
Right.
Are there other things people can do to improve sleep quality?
Creating a relaxing bedtime ritual can be helpful too.
Like what kinds of things?
Things like taking a warm bath, reading a book, or listening to calming music can make a big difference.
It's like setting the stage for a good night's sleep.
Precisely. And just like any habit, it takes consistency and repetition to train your body and mind to prioritize sleep.
Now, this next one really stood out to me.
Okay.
The podcast talks about nourishing your body with the right foods and how what you eat can actually impact your mood.
Interesting.
Yeah. I always kind of thought of food as fuel,
Right.
but I never really connected it to my mental state.
We often underestimate the profound impact our diet can have on our mental health. You're right, food is fuel, but it's also information that directly influences how our brains function.
So are there specific foods that can actually help combat depression?
There's a growing body of research suggesting that what we eat can actually influence the balance of bacteria in our gut,
Okay.
which, believe it or not, plays a significant role in our mood.
Wait, so our gut bacteria can affect our mood?
It might sound strange, but it's true. We have trillions of bacteria living in our digestive system, and they actually produce neurotransmitters.
Wow.
Those chemical messengers that control our mood, sleep, and even our thought processes.
So are you saying that our gut is like a second brain?
In a way, yes. There's constant communication going on between our gut and our brain.
Yeah.
And the health of our gut microbiome can have a profound impact on our mental well-being.
Wow, that's incredible. I never realized the connection was so strong. So what kinds of foods should we be eating to support our gut health and, by extension, our mental health?
Focusing on whole, unprocessed foods is key. Fruits, vegetables, whole grains, lean protein, and healthy fats are all important. And fermented foods like yogurt, sauerkraut, and kimchi are particularly beneficial because they introduce healthy bacteria into our gut.
So it's not just about avoiding junk food. It's about actively nourishing our gut with the right foods.
Exactly.
It's almost like we're feeding two brains at once.
You could say that.
Now, this next strategy seems particularly important, especially when you're feeling down.
Okay.
The podcast talks about the importance of challenging negative thoughts.
Right.
And they say that depression can lead to kind of this spiral of negative thinking, which can be incredibly hard to break free from. Have you seen that in your work?
Absolutely. Negative thoughts are like a broken record playing in your head, constantly reinforcing those feelings of hopelessness and despair.
Yeah.
The key is to recognize that those thoughts aren't necessarily true. They're often distortions created by our depressed state.
So how do we challenge those negative thoughts? Do we just try to ignore them?
Ignoring them rarely works.
Right.
It's like trying to ignore a smoke alarm. It just gets louder and more insistent. Instead, we need to actively question those thoughts.
What do you mean by questioning them?
Ask yourself, is this thought really true?
Okay.
What evidence do I have to support this thought? Is there another way to look at this situation?
So it's about kind of playing detective with our own thoughts, like examining the evidence and looking for alternative explanations.
Exactly. It's like retraining your brain to think more objectively and realistically.
That makes sense.
Oh.
Okay, let's move on to strategy number 7, which is about setting small, achievable goals.
Right.
And they emphasize that when you're feeling depressed, even the simplest tasks can feel overwhelming.
Yeah, it's true.
Why is that? And how do small goals help?
Depression can sap our energy and motivation, making even getting out of bed feel like climbing Mount Everest.
Right.
Setting small, attainable goals helps break that cycle. Instead of focusing on the summit, focus on the next step.
Okay, so instead of saying, I'm going to clean the entire house today, which can feel really daunting.
Right.
I might say, I'm going to clear off the kitchen counter.
Precisely. And by achieving that small goal, you get a little boost of dopamine, that neurotransmitter that's associated with reward and motivation. That boost, as small as it might seem, can be enough to build momentum and encourage you to take on the next step.
It's like those video games where you start with, small quests.
Yes.
You kind of level up as you go. And each small accomplishment gives you the confidence and the motivation to tackle bigger challenges.
I love that analogy.
It's a perfect analogy. And the podcast also emphasizes the importance of celebrating those small wins, even if they seem insignificant to other people. Why is that so crucial?
When we're depressed, we tend to focus on what's wrong, on our failures and shortcomings. Celebrating small wins helps shift our perspective.
Okay.
And reminds us that we're capable of making progress even when it doesn't feel like it. It's like building a muscle of positivity.
It's about retraining our brains to focus on the positive, even in the midst of difficult circumstances. Okay, on to strategy number 8. This one might be my favorite. Engage in activities that bring joy.
Oh, I like that one.
It sounds so simple, but it can be so hard when you're feeling depressed.
Right. You're absolutely right. Depression can steal our joy and make everything feel gray and meaningless. That's why it's essential to actively seek out activities that once brought us pleasure, even if they don't feel enjoyable at the moment.
But what if you've just lost interest in everything? What if nothing sparks joy anymore?
That's where a little experimentation comes in.
Okay.
Try revisiting hobbies you once enjoyed, even if you haven't done them in years. Or explore something completely new, like taking a dance class, joining a book club, learning to play an instrument. The key is to be open to trying new things and to be patient with yourself.
So it's about actively seeking out those sparks of joy, even if they feel, buried deep down.
Exactly. And remember, it's not about forcing yourself to feel happy. It's about creating opportunities for joy to emerge.
Now, this next one might be a bit controversial.
Oh.
Limit social media and news consumption.
Yeah.
I know this is a tough one for a lot of people, myself included. But the podcast argues that these can be particularly harmful when you're feeling depressed. Why is that?
Think about it this way. When you're feeling down, are you more likely to be drawn to uplifting, positive content or to things that kind of confirm your negative feelings?
Probably the latter.
Exactly. Our brains have a negativity bias. We're wired to pay more attention to threats and negative information. This bias is thought to be an evolutionary adaptation that helped us survive in dangerous environments.
It's like our brains are hardwired to focus on threats.
Exactly. But in today's world, where we're constantly bombarded with information, that negativity bias can work against us.
Especially when we're scrolling through social media or watching the news, right?
Yeah, right. Social media often presents a distorted view of reality, showcasing people's highlight reels, fueling feelings of comparison and inadequacy. And the news, by its very nature, tends to focus on negative events.
So it's like we're feeding our brains a steady diet of negativity.
You could say that. And when we're already feeling depressed, that negativity can be incredibly toxic.
Right.
It can amplify our existing negative thoughts and feelings and make it even harder to see the good in our lives.
So it's not that we should bury our heads in the sand and ignore the world,
Right.
but rather that we need to be mindful of the information we consume, especially when we're feeling vulnerable.
Precisely. It's about protecting our mental space and creating a more positive and supportive environment for ourselves.
It's like creating a mental diet of healthy, nourished content.
Exactly.
And finally, the last strategy is to seek professional help when needed.
Okay.
And the podcast really stresses that depression is a real illness, and that sometimes we need professional support to overcome it. What are your thoughts on this?
There's no shame in seeking professional help.
Yeah.
In fact, it's a sign of strength and self-awareness. Therapists, counselors, and psychiatrists have the training and expertise to help us understand and manage depression.
It's like going to the doctor when you have a physical ailment.
Exactly.
You wouldn't hesitate to seek medical attention for, a broken leg, so why hesitate when it comes to our mental health?
Exactly. And just like a broken leg needs time and proper care to heal, so does depression.
All right, so that covers all 10 strategies. Before we move on to kind of a deeper dive into the science behind these strategies, are there any key takeaways you want to highlight for our listeners?
I think the most important takeaway is that you're not alone. Depression is more common than you might think, and there is help available. These strategies offer a roadmap to recovery. But remember, it's a journey, not a destination.
Right.
It's about making small, consistent changes over time and being kind to yourself along the way.
I love that. Progress over perfection, right? And I want to remind our listeners that we'll have links to additional resources in the show notes.
Great.
So be sure to check those out. Okay, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll delve deeper into the fascinating science behind these strategies. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Before the break, we went over those 10 strategies for overcoming depression. Now let's get into the science behind why these tips actually work.
Yeah, I think it's really helpful to understand the how and the why.
Exactly.
Makes it, less like you're just following these random tips and more like you have tools you can use.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's start with that first strategy, acknowledging your feelings. From a scientific perspective, what's actually going on in our brains when we try to suppress those negative emotions?
Well, it's not so much that those emotions just disappear. It's more like we're pushing them into a mental closet and hoping they'll just go away on their own. But that closet only has so much space.
Right. And all that mental clutter can't be good. No, not at all. And what's interesting is that when we try to suppress our emotions, we actually trigger our stress response.
Oh, really?
Yeah, our bodies release cortisol, the stress hormone, and over time that can have all sorts of negative effects.
Like what?
Like inflammation, weakened immunity, and even an increased risk of chronic diseases.
So those bottled up emotions are doing more than just making us feel bad in the moment. They're actually impacting our physical health too.
Exactly. And it's not just those big dramatic emotions either. Even suppressing those everyday annoyances like getting stuck in traffic can contribute to this buildup of stress.
So acknowledging our emotions, even the small ones, is an act of self-care.
Absolutely.
And you mentioned earlier that journaling can be a really powerful way to process those emotions. Is there a scientific reason for that?
There's a growing body of research suggesting that writing about our emotions can actually have therapeutic benefits.
Interesting.
One theory is that by putting our feelings into words, we're kind of organizing our thoughts, making sense of our experiences.
It's like taking this jumbled mess of thoughts and turning it into a coherent story.
Exactly. And that act of creating a narrative can be incredibly healing.
Especially when we're dealing with difficult emotions, I imagine.
Absolutely.
Now let's shift gears and talk about the power of human connection. We talked before about how isolation can worsen depression. But what's actually happening in our brains, biologically, when we connect with other people?
Well, when we engage in those meaningful social interactions, our brains release oxytocin.
Oh yeah, the cuddle hormone.
Exactly. It has a calming effect on the nervous system and promotes feelings of trust and bonding and belonging.
It's like our brains are actually wired to crave that connection.
They are. And when that need is met, it has this ripple effect on our overall well-being. Studies have shown that people with strong social support networks tend to be more resilient to stress, they have better physical health, and they even live longer.
Wow. So reaching out to others, it's not just about feeling better in the moment, It's an investment in our long-term health and happiness.
Exactly. It's one of the most powerful things you can do for yourself.
Okay, let's talk about one of my favorite topics, the magic of movement. You mentioned before that just 5 minutes of exercise can trigger the release of endorphins. Can you tell us more about those amazing mood-boosting chemicals?
Sure. So endorphins are basically our body's natural painkillers and mood elevators. They bind to the same receptors in our brain as opioid drugs,
Wow.
producing feelings of euphoria and well-being.
So it's like getting a natural high, but without any negative side effects.
Exactly. And you don't need to run a marathon to experience those benefits. Even gentle activities like walking, stretching, or gardening can trigger those endorphins.
That's good news. What about on those days where even the thought of moving feels exhausting, though?
I understand. Depression can make even the simplest activities feel completely overwhelming, but research actually suggests that exercise can increase energy levels over time.
Oh, interesting.
It's like priming the pump.
So even though it might feel counterintuitive at first, pushing ourselves to move, even a little bit, can actually help us feel more energized in the long run.
Precisely. And it's not just about endorphins either. Exercise also helps regulate those other neurotransmitters that are involved in mood.
Right, like dopamine and serotonin.
Exactly. Dopamine is associated with motivation and reward and pleasure, while serotonin helps regulate mood and sleep and appetite.
So exercise is like a multivitamin for our brains.
I love that analogy.
It's like giving our brains all the essential nutrients we need to feel good.
Oh, you're right.
Now, let's talk about sleep. We talked before about how it's our body's time to repair and recharge, but what's actually happening in our brains while we sleep that's so important for mental health?
Well, sleep is much more than just rest. It's an active process that's essential for all sorts of brain functions. During sleep, our brains process emotions, they consolidate memories, and they clear out toxins that build up throughout the day.
So like a nightly detox.
Exactly. When we don't get enough sleep, this cleaning process is disrupted. It's like letting the garbage pile up in your house. Eventually, it's going to start to smell.
Right, and that buildup of mental garbage can contribute to depression.
It can. Chronic sleep deprivation has been linked to all sorts of mental health problems, including depression, anxiety, and even impaired cognitive function.
So getting enough sleep, it's not just about feeling rested, it's really about protecting our mental health.
Exactly. And it's not just the quantity of sleep that matters, but the quality as well.
What do you mean by quality sleep?
Quality sleep refers to how well you sleep, not just how long. So it's about falling asleep easily, staying asleep throughout the night, and waking up feeling refreshed.
So if I'm tossing and turning all night, that doesn't count as quality sleep, even if I technically got 8 hours.
Not really.
Wow.
Your brain needs to cycle through different stages of sleep to fully recharge. And if those cycles are disrupted, you're not going to reap the full benefits, even if you're spending enough time in bed.
Okay, so how do we improve the quality of our sleep? We've talked about some tips, like sticking to a bedtime routine, avoiding screens before bed, but are there other things we can do?
Creating that relaxing bedtime ritual can be really helpful. Things like taking a warm bath, reading a book, or listening to calming music can make a big difference.
Yeah, setting the stage for a good night's sleep.
Precisely. And just as important as creating that conducive sleep environment is addressing any underlying sleep disorders. Things like insomnia or sleep apnea can significantly impact sleep quality.
Right, and those need to be addressed with a healthcare professional.
Exactly.
Okay, so prioritizing sleep is this multifaceted approach. It's about creating the right environment, adopting healthy sleep habits, and addressing any underlying issues that might be interfering with our sleep.
Precisely.
Now let's talk about something that I found really fascinating, the link between our gut health and our mental health. You mentioned that our gut microbiome, all those trillions of bacteria living in our digestive tract, can actually influence our mood.
It's true.
How is that even possible?
It might sound strange, but the gut and the brain are in constant communication. Scientists call this the gut-brain axis. And as it turns out, the bacteria in our gut play a really significant role in that communication.
So it's like our gut has its own little nervous system.
You could think of it that way. The gut microbiome actually produces neurotransmitters.
Really?
Yeah, those chemical messengers that control our mood, sleep, even our thought processes.
Wow, so those gut feelings we talk about are more than just metaphors.
There's actually a real biological basis for them, and research is suggesting that the composition of our gut microbiome can influence our susceptibility to all sorts of mental health conditions.
Like depression and anxiety.
Exactly.
So taking care of our gut health is really essential for taking care of our mental health.
They're all connected.
So what are some things that people can do to support the health of their gut microbiome?
Diet is a really powerful tool we have. Eating a diverse range of fiber-rich foods like fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes helps nourish the beneficial bacteria in our gut.
And what about fermented foods? We were talking about those earlier.
Fermented foods are great because they're rich in probiotics, which are live bacteria that can help replenish and diversify our gut microbiome.
So it's like giving our gut a boost of healthy bacteria.
Exactly. And in addition to diet, managing stress, getting enough sleep, and avoiding unnecessary antibiotics can all support gut health.
So it's a holistic approach, just like with so many other aspects of well-being.
Precisely.
Okay. Let's move on to a strategy that's all about rewiring our thinking, challenging those negative thoughts. We touched on this briefly before the break, but can you talk more about why it's so important to question those negative thought patterns?
Sure. So when we're depressed, our brains have this tendency to focus on the negative. They filter out the positive information and amplify those negative experiences. And this negative thought loop can be so powerful, it can feel like we're just trapped in this downward spiral.
It's like those funhouse mirrors that distort our image and make everything look kind of warped and out of proportion.
That's a perfect analogy. And the key to breaking free from this negative thought loop is recognizing that those thoughts aren't necessarily true, they're just thoughts.
Right.
And often, they're distorted by our depressed state.
So how do we start to challenge those thoughts? What are some strategies people can use?
One effective technique is called cognitive reframing.
Okay.
It's about identifying those negative thoughts, questioning their validity, and then consciously choosing to reframe them in a more balanced and realistic way.
Can you give an example of what that might look like in real life?
Absolutely. Let's say you make a mistake at work, and your immediate thought is, I'm such a failure, I'm going to get fired.
Right.
That's pretty harsh and probably unrealistic.
Right, very black and white thinking.
Exactly. So instead of dwelling on that catastrophic thought, you can challenge it.
Okay.
You can ask yourself, is there another way to look at this situation? Maybe you made a simple mistake that can be easily corrected. Maybe it's an opportunity to learn and grow from this.
So taking a step back and trying to look at the situation more objectively.
Precisely. And instead of beating yourself up, you could focus on what you can learn from the experience, how you can avoid making the same mistake in the future.
It's like turning that negative experience into a positive learning opportunity.
Exactly. And that shift in perspective can make all the difference.
Okay, I'm starting to see how powerful this can be. Now, let's talk about a strategy that can feel incredibly difficult when you're struggling with depression, and that's setting small, achievable goals.
Yeah, I agree.
Why is this so important? And how can we make those goals feel less daunting?
Well, when we're feeling depressed, our motivation and our energy levels plummet. Even simple tasks can feel overwhelming. Setting small, attainable goals can help us break down those seemingly insurmountable tasks into manageable steps.
So instead of looking at the whole mountain, we're just focusing on the next step on the trail.
Exactly. And by achieving that small goal, no matter how insignificant it might seem, we get that little boost of dopamine.
Right, that feel-good neurotransmitter.
Exactly. And those small rewards, they add up over time, and they help build momentum and motivation.
So what are some examples of small, achievable goals that people could set when they're starting to feel really overwhelmed?
It could be something as simple as just getting out of bed and taking a shower.
Okay.
Making a healthy breakfast. Or even just taking 5 minutes to sit outside and enjoy the fresh air.
Right.
The key is to choose something that feels manageable, even on your toughest days.
It's about meeting ourselves where we are and not setting these unrealistic expectations.
Exactly. And as you start to feel a little bit more energized, a little bit more motivated, you can gradually increase the challenge level of those goals.
Like a video game, where you start with those easy levels and then work your way up to the more challenging ones.
I love that. That's a great analogy. And just like in a video game, celebrating those small wins along the way is so important. It helps reinforce those positive feelings and it motivates you to keep going.
So it's not about, berating ourselves for what we haven't accomplished, but actually acknowledging and celebrating the progress that we have made, no matter how small.
Exactly. Shifting the focus from what's wrong to what's right.
Now, let's talk about a strategy that I think a lot of people, especially in today's world, really struggle with, and that's limiting social media and news consumption. Why is it so important to be mindful of the information that we're taking in, especially when we're feeling vulnerable?
Well, our brains have what we call a negativity bias, which basically means we tend to pay more attention to negative information than positive information. And it's thought to be an evolutionary adaptation that helped us survive in dangerous environments.
So our brains are hardwired to focus on threats.
Exactly. But in today's world where we're constantly bombarded with information, that negativity bias can work against us.
Especially when we're scrolling through social media or watching the news.
Right. Social media often presents a very distorted view of reality. It showcases people's highlight reels.
Right.
And it fuels those feelings of comparison and inadequacy. And the news, by its very nature, tends to focus on negative events.
So it's like we're feeding our brains a steady diet of negativity.
You could say that. And when we're already feeling depressed, that negativity can be really toxic.
Right.
It can amplify our existing negative thoughts and feelings, and it can make it even harder to see the good in our lives.
So it's not about ignoring the world or pretending that everything's perfect.
Yeah.
It's just about being mindful of the information that we're consuming and making choices that support our mental well-being.
Exactly. It's about setting boundaries and creating a more positive and supportive environment for ourselves.
And sometimes that means taking a break from social media, limiting our exposure to news, and seeking out content that inspires and uplifts us.
Absolutely. Being proactive and taking control of our mental diet.
Now, let's talk about a strategy that's incredibly important, but often carries a lot of stigma, and that's seeking professional help. When is it time to reach out for that professional support? And what are the benefits of doing so?
Well, there's absolutely no shame in seeking professional help. In fact, it's a sign of strength and self-awareness. Depression is a complex illness, and it often requires professional intervention.
It's like going to the doctor when we have a physical ailment, right?
Yeah.
We wouldn't hesitate to seek medical attention for a broken leg, so why hesitate when it comes to our mental health?
Exactly. And just like a broken leg needs time and proper care to heal, so does depression. Therapists, counselors, and psychiatrists have the training and the expertise to help us understand our depression, to develop coping mechanisms, and to work toward recovery.
So what are some signs that it might be time to seek professional help?
If you're feeling overwhelmed by your symptoms,
Yeah.
if you're having trouble functioning in your daily life, or if you're having thoughts of harming yourself or others, it's essential to reach out for help right away.
And even if, your symptoms aren't that severe, but you've been struggling for a while and you just haven't been able to find relief on your own, seeking professional guidance can be incredibly beneficial.
Absolutely. There's no shame in asking for help, and it could be the most important step that you take on your journey to recovery.
Okay, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into the science behind these 10 strategies for overcoming depression.
We have. It's fascinating, isn't it?
It really is. All this stuff that's going on beneath the surface.
It highlights the fact that depression isn't just a matter of willpower.
Right.
It's not just snapping out of it.
Right.
There are real biological and psychological factors at play.
Exactly. And understanding those factors can be so empowering, It can help us take charge of our mental health. We're going to take another quick break, and when we come back, we'll explore some final thoughts on this topic and talk about what we can all do to support our mental well-being in the long run. Stay tuned. Welcome back to The Deep Dive. We've spent this episode talking about 10 strategies for overcoming depression and learned about the science behind why they work. Now, I want to shift gears a bit and talk about how we can actually use this information, put it into practice.
Yeah, I think that's the most important part, because knowledge is really only powerful when you apply it.
Exactly. So as we wrap up our deep dive, what are some key takeaways that you hope our listeners will, take with them?
I think the most important takeaway is that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to overcome depression. It's about finding the strategies that work best for you as an individual.
Right, like finding what resonates with you.
Exactly, and figuring out how to incorporate those strategies into your life in a way that feels, sustainable.
It's like building your own personalized toolkit.
Exactly. And, it's a journey, not a race. There will be good days and bad days, but the key is just to keep moving forward, even if it's just one small step at a time.
And to be kind to ourselves along the way.
Absolutely. Self-compassion is so important, especially when we're struggling.
One thing that's really stood out to me throughout this whole conversation is how interconnected all of these strategies are.
Oh, yeah.
It's like they all work together,
They do. Those strategies aren't meant to be implemented in isolation. They work best when they're kind of woven together, into this tapestry of well-being.
Right. So it's like nourishing our bodies with healthy foods can support our gut health, which in turn can actually improve our mood and make it easier to, engage in activities that bring us joy.
Right. And prioritizing sleep can help improve our cognitive function, which can make it easier to challenge those negative thoughts. And connecting with others can provide that sense of support and belonging, which can reduce those feelings of isolation that can make depression feel so overwhelming.
Yeah, so it's like creating this positive feedback loop.
Exactly.
Where each strategy kind of amplifies the benefits of the others.
Precisely. And you might find, as you start to implement some of these strategies, that you notice this ripple effect on other areas of your life.
Oh, interesting.
It might feel more energized, more motivated, more connected to yourselves, to the world around you.
It's like a chain reaction of positive change.
I like that. That's a good way to put it. And it's important to remember that even small changes can make a big difference.
Right, so we don't have to overhaul our entire lives overnight. It's about taking these small, consistent steps toward creating a life that, feels more aligned with our values and goals.
Exactly. Progress over perfection.
Yeah, I want to circle back to something that you mentioned earlier about seeking professional help. I think there's still so much stigma surrounding mental health, which can prevent people from, reaching out when they really need support. What would you say to someone who's hesitant to seek help?
I would say that seeking professional help is actually a sign of strength, not weakness. It takes courage to acknowledge that you need support and to reach out for guidance. And therapists and counselors and psychiatrists, they're there to help.
Right.
They're there to help you navigate those challenges and find a path towards healing.
It's like having a coach in your corner, guiding you and cheering you on.
Exactly. And just like a coach can help you achieve your athletic goals, a therapist can help you achieve your mental health goals.
Right. And there's so many different types of therapy available. It's really about finding the approach that feels right for you.
Absolutely. And there are a lot of resources available online and in communities, so, don't hesitate to reach out for support.
That's a great point. And as always, we will have links to additional resources in the show notes. So as we wrap up our deep dive into overcoming depression, is there a final thought-provoking question that you'd like to leave our listeners with? Something for them to kind of ponder as they, embark on their own journey toward healing and well-being?
I would ask, what is one small, achievable step that you can take today to nurture your mental health? It could be anything. Taking a 5-minute walk, calling a friend, scheduling an appointment with a therapist.
Yeah, it's a great reminder that we all have the power to make choices that support our mental well-being, no matter where we are in our journey.
And remember, you're not alone. There is hope, and there is help available.
That's a great message to end on. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into overcoming depression. We hope that you found it informative and insightful and empowering. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.